Hey everyone, Dr. Cam here. Welcome to Maximus Call-In Radio Show number 28. We are continuing our theme of maximizing masculinity and health. So following our call-in radio show format, we are open to any and all questions that you have about maximizing your health in terms of your mind, your body, or your masculinity, and relationship, even questions that we like to take as well. So if you are joining us on Twitter Spaces, hey Alan. We have some folks joining us on Clubhouse, YouTube Live, Instagram, TikTok, and our loyal Discord followers as well. Hey, Zachary, thanks for joining us. Hey, Greg, thanks for joining us as well. So we always start out the radio show with a weekly unpopular opinion. And so we actually had a question last week about the relationship between testosterone maximization and ADHD. Testosterone optimization, or whether it's replacement, is not sort of a standard medical treatment for ADHD. But I did a little bit of research, and there's an interesting potential benefits. There's essentially a bi-directional relationship between testosterone and dopamine. And if you think about it, most of the stimulant medications that are used as the most common treatments for ADHD are dopaminergic drugs or agonists. Most people are familiar with Adderall, which is the brand name for mixed amphetamine salts, which are dopamine agonists. So they increase the amount of dopamine in the brain, which helps people with motivation, reward, and focus. Interestingly, there's also a relationship between dopamine and testosterone. So the HPA axis, when you have a dopamine agonist, actually increases the amount of a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. That in turn releases luteinizing hormone, which increases testosterone. So the interesting finding is essentially drugs that increase dopamine tend to increase testosterone as well. Not to necessarily huge super physiological amounts, but that's sort of the relationship that you tend to see. So similarly, any testosterone optimizing substance that increases that gonadotropin hormone releasing hormone or increases LH may have similar effects on dopamine as well. And so you do sort of anecdotally, you hear when folks have higher testosterone levels, they do report an increased sort of drive or approach motivation that you would typically see in folks that are taking sort of dopamine agonists. They don't necessarily function in the same way. Obviously, Adderall is a very psychoactive, stimulating, you cannot sleep when you're on that. Versus testosterone, it's a much more level sort of energy. It doesn't feel like caffeine, doesn't feel like a stimulant. It doesn't necessarily feel psychoactive in the same way. But it does help with, focus and concentration and drive. And so it's a different, obviously very different type of drug, but essentially testosterone and dopamine tend to go sort of hand in hand. And so I actually think sort of there's a very interesting emerging field that is essentially neuroendocrinology, which takes sort of different approach to psychiatry. In psychiatry, like I said, if you're sort of treating classic psychiatric conditions like ADHD, you prescribe typical drugs like Adderall. Most commonly, in addition, there's Ritalin, methylphenidate, Concerta, Vyvanse, but they're all kind of similar drugs in that they usually either increase dopamine or norepinephrine or some combination thereof. They essentially target very specific neurotransmitters in the brain. They feel very psychoactive. You can kind of tell that they're working subjectively on the part of the patient. An interesting sort of novel emerging approach, and I just think there needs to be more research done, is sort of this neuroendocrinology approach, which is as opposed to directly utilizing drugs that cross the blood-brain barrier and target specific neurotransmitter systems, you optimize hormones, which include testosterone, vitamin D, oxytocin, etc. And these are kind of master hormones. They have a multitude of effects, and so they can, in addition to obviously increasing the target hormone, may increase dopamine and other sort of neurotransmitters as sort of ancillary or side effects as well. But they may have pretty significant effects on mood and psychological functioning. I'm not recommending them for that particular purpose. Like I said, I think more research needs to be done, but we can tell you subjectively and clinically from folks that do testosterone optimization or maximization, they oftentimes do report, feeling better, and there's psychological effects in addition to the physiological effects. So people are obviously familiar with the physiological effects in terms of increased muscle mass, decreased fat mass, improvements in sports performance, which are all sort of clinically validated findings. But there are psychological effects as well. One study, in fact, that increased testosterone pharmacologically found some interesting psychological and mood effects, which I have mentioned before, which is they found actually a decrease in anger, contrary to the roid rage stereotype, improvements in irritability, decreases in sadness, nervousness, and anxiety, and tiredness or fatigue. And in addition to that, they also found that there was an increase in friendliness, which is kind of interesting. I always say hypermasculinity is actually very warm, right? Someone who's very masculine is actually friendly because they're sort of secure in themselves. Increases in energy, and obviously an increase in overall sense of well-being. So I really think this is a really exciting and emerging new area of neuroendocrinology, and that in the future we're not just going to use SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or dopamine or norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors or agonists, because I really think these simple neurotransmitter hypothesis that schizophrenia is caused by an excess of dopamine or depression is caused by a lack of serotonin, these are overly simplistic models, and I think the field has to really emerge beyond that. And I really think the whole field of hormone optimization, or sort of endocrinology, and the neurological effects of that, which is why it's called neuroendocrinology, is a very promising novel approach. And I think there's definitely more research that needs to be done, and it'll be interesting to see sort of the clinical results continue to come out in terms of the benefits, because I think if you're having low testosterone or a deficiency in vitamin D, it's going to affect your mood, and you should probably fix those things before you go and mess with your neurotransmitters, which can have oftentimes side effects. SSRIs classically have a lot of sexual side effects, potential withdrawal symptoms. Some of them have black box warnings in terms of exacerbating suicidality and things like that. So, not making any particular medication recommendations or medical advice, but I do think it's a promising and emerging, field of study, and it's worth looking into. And I consider it an unpopular opinion because no one's really talking about this as sort of a novel way of improving your mood through hormones. And I think it should be studied more and it should be tried more because, quite frankly, the cornucopia of psychiatric medications that we have are mildly to moderately effective, but they don't work for everyone, and I don't think they're panaceas. And the reason that people have mood disorders varies. Like for some people, they had a breakup and really they need therapy. They don't need any medication. Other people, they live in the Pacific Northwest or the Northeast, and they're not getting vitamin D, and they need vitamin D, and that's what's inhibiting their mood. They have seasonal affective disorder, and that's why they're depressed. So I think the future of medicine is really personalization. You got to find out what the etiology or cause is of people's issues, and now we also need better tools, including hormonal tools, to address that. So that's this week's unpopular opinion, and let's take some questions from the audience. I think there's some folks who raising their hands on Clubhouse. Let me see if I can get them to speak up. Hey there.
Well, I'm just like really glad you made that first monologue, because I agree furiously. That's amazing. And just to add one anecdote to that, like one thing that was impactful to me personally for my mood was just figuring out that I had it in THFR and supplementing with methylated folate and methylated B12, and it's made a really big difference for me. So totally agree that a personalized approach and understanding the etiology is critical. I guess, and then for the question, one thing that's been interesting to me is like, what if you make an intervention like increasing your testosterone, suddenly you feel more confident, um, you have better focus, you really do fundamentally change, at least in many instances.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly when I've you know spoken to some people that have made these changes, they found big sort of psychological results. And I guess the question is like, how do you guide people through integrating their new psychology into their existing life? Because
Yes.
at least from what I've seen, sometimes that really causes them to reevaluate everything, and sort of start from scratch.
Yeah, what a fantastic question, and that's actually like a deeply philosophical question, right? Which is it's almost gets to this question of like who are you, right? Like are you kind of your I think of us as sort of biopsychosocial beings, right? We're obviously biological beings that are highly influenced by our genes and our neurochemistry, right? And that's kind of what you're given. We can modify it obviously to some degree with drugs or even with our environment and with our behaviors. Everything sort of has a neurochemical effect to some degree, although there's quite a bit of variance in terms of the effects. We're obviously psychological human beings. Everything that we encounter influences, our well-being and our personality, and we're social creatures as well. Human beings in particular, highly socially influenced, and in fact, that better predicts behavior a lot of times than even your underlying personality is group pressure and what the environmental surroundings are. So it becomes this interesting question, right? Like if you change your neurochemistry or your neuroendocrinology, and all of a sudden your personality is different, right? Like as I mentioned, you're less angry, you're friendlier, you're less irritable, you're less sad, you're less nervous, you're more confident. Is that you, or is that the new you? And I don't know the answer to that. It's kind of an interesting question because it supposes that there is a true you. I guess my point of view is that there really isn't, I would say, necessarily a super stable sense of self in the way that we think. Now, if you look at, for instance, personality traits, they tend to be, if you retest them, generally reliable over the lifespan. Now, we do know that people mellow out when they age a little bit, like they become more agreeable, for instance, a little bit more conscientious, things like that. But for the most part, they're not dramatically, changing who they are. Now, to your point, though, once you start really like messing with your neurochemistry and your hormones, you can actually sometimes see drastic effects. I would say, at least in my clinical observation, it doesn't like change people from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde. They're not like fundamentally changing their personality. I think it really brings out the best parts of people's personality. So if you take the example, let's say, of anxiety, right? It's hard to argue that anxiety is necessarily like a characterological trait. Neuroticism, I guess, is one of the big five, and anxiety is a subfacet of neuroticism. But I actually find that it holds people back more, because there's a lot of folks, for instance, that I know that are actually overall extroverted, right? They get energy from being around people. They're gregarious. They like socializing, but they have a little bit of social anxiety, and that actually holds them back. So they actually look introverted, even though they like socializing, being around people. Now, if you alleviated that anxiety, whether through a medication or through an exposure-based therapy, and all of a sudden the anxiety is gone, now they're going to look dramatically different. They're going to be much more outgoing. They're going to be less socially inhibited. They're going to look more extroverted. So have they changed fundamentally their personality? I would argue no. I think they almost had the latent elements of extroversion that were always there, but one of the emotional barriers or blockers to acting or behaving in a way that's more extroverted has now been removed, and so they're going to look different. So I actually think it really almost depends on where your underlying functioning is, right? So if you have a high degree of irritability, fatigue, and anxiety, and all of a sudden by optimizing your hormones or your micronutrients or whatever it is, it unblocks those things because they've been acting as barriers, you are going to look dramatically different. If you don't have a lot of struggle with those things, your energy levels are good, your mood is good, you're generally focused, you're a highly driven person, optimizing your hormones or your micronutrients may make you slightly better, but I don't think it's going to be a night or day difference because you may not have a lot of blockers. So that's why it's so interesting. It's almost like there's a lot of individual variability in sort of the response. Now, to your question, how do you help people kind of integrate that when there are drastic changes? And that's exactly the philosophy of the Maximus program, right? Is we don't just take a pharmacological approach to testosterone optimization. We use medications, supplements, and behavioral intervention. And I actually think the behavioral intervention is the most underrated and important part of it. It may not be the component that increases the testosterone the most. Now, we know that, like, for instance, if you're only getting 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night and you increase that to 8, that will make a pretty significant bump in testosterone. But I would say it'd make an even bigger bump in terms of your energy and your mood and focus, all those things. It's just, regardless of your testosterone levels, if you're sleeping 4 to 5 hours a night, you're just not going to look good. You're not going to feel good and not going to perform well. So first, it's all about sort of fixing that. But the pharmacological component increases or boosts testosterone much more. The behavioral component is making sure that you're channeling that appropriately. And that's where it's really important to have goals, accountability, and structure. So I'll give you an interesting analogy from psychiatry. I mentioned earlier Adderall, right, which is a very common medication for ADHD. Now, if you have true clinically validated ADHD, you're almost driven to distraction. You may have sort of a hypoarousal deficiency in dopamine, or at least a dysregulation in dopaminergic functioning. And so by taking Adderall, it improves that underlying condition and it helps you focus. Now, here's the weird trick to it, though. The drug doesn't help you focus on the right thing. There's a lot of anecdotal cases, in fact, of folks taking Adderall and then they just like spend the next few hours like perfectionistically cleaning their room, right? And while that may be a great thing, they really needed to study for an exam or they needed to get some work done. So that's the interesting thing. I really think with a lot of these medications, you have to combine it with a behavioral intervention, which is you have to teach people skills to be like, all right, you're going to take this for the next 4 hours while the half-life is pretty high, or is active and the levels in your blood are very high. You're going to have a tendency to hyper-focus. Now, that also means that you have to make sure that you're set up to not get distracted, right? It's going to help you sustain your attention so that you avoid getting distracted. But in the first place, you got to focus on the right thing. So you almost have to carve out the space, make sure you have the next 4 hours free. You set up your environment so there's not a lot of distractions. And then that way you can really get those 4 hours of studying in. The medication is going to wear off. You're going to kind of go back to your old self, if you will. But you'll have utilized the medication that time very well. I actually think it's the same exact thing for testosterone, where it can increase libido and sexual drive, right? And while that's a great thing, most guys love that. If you have a tendency towards hypersexuality or addiction, it can be precarious, because what if you spend all your time going on random Tinder dates and, having promiscuous sex, increasing your risk of STIs, wasting a lot of your time and energy, and you're not channeling that in a positive, pro-social, productive way that's aligned with your core values, then that's a problem, right? Now, that's not a problem of the medication. It's a problem of, okay, now that I have this libido, how can I channel it? And I think a lot of, if you read, psychological, even spiritual literature, it talks about, for guys, it's really important to channel the libido and sublimate it towards creative pursuits, right? A lot of people, in fact, would argue all great works of art are essentially sublimations of the libido, right? So that's exactly why we put people into small online groups. We provide them with, coaching and accountability to be like, all right, great. Now you have greater energy. Now you have greater drive. Now you have greater libido. But let's talk about what are the things that are important. Like, first of all, let's take care of your health behaviors. Let's fix your diet, your exercise, your sleep, your focus, but also your relationships, right? And intimacy does increase testosterone. Like people who are more sexually active have higher levels of testosterone. If you're around attractive women, increases your testosterone. And so, you can slightly alter your testosterone in that way. But the bigger and more important reason we actually help people with intimacy and relationships is to make sure that they're channeling their testosterone appropriately and they're not getting addicted to pornography. They're not excessively masturbating. They're not going around chasing, sort of women in a way that's inappropriate, but making sure that it's tempered in a way that they're obviously enjoying themselves, able to express their sexuality in a healthy way, but in a way that doesn't take away from their life. It really adds to their life. And that, in my opinion, is really the art of psychology, right? There's no like right answer to like how do you change your, or how do you spend your energy or your time, right? That's I think a deeply individualistic answer. There's no psychologist or doctor that can really, should in fact tell you what to do. But obviously, I think you can kind of understand what people's values are and help them understand are the behaviors that they're engaging in, particularly if they're impulsive or compulsive, causing a distraction or a detraction from their values, or are they acting in a way where now with this newfound energy, libido, drive, etc., are they channeling it into working really hard, driving towards their goals, pursuing their values, pursuing meaningful relationships, pursuing meaningful, satisfying work? And that comes from the long, harder term work of sort of therapy, coaching, group support. So I think in the long term, it's actually much more important. And that's why we have an integrated program. So I think it's a great question. I'm going to actually follow up with a question for you, because I think you made a really good point in terms of something that helped you, and I think it may help other people who are listening. Can you talk, Alan, if you're still listening, about how you found out about that genetic variant? Like, did you do a DNA test where you became aware of that, and how you addressed that through supplementation?
So funny enough, I sort of did the opposite. I sort of I had a friend living with me. He just had this supplement on his night table. I was like, oh, what's this? It's a methylated. It's good if you have MTHFR. So I was like, oh, interesting. I guess I'll just try one. And then what ensued was just like the best focus I've had in my entire life, and I was just like blown away by the effects that this just methylated vitamin had. So then I was like, okay, maybe I have the MTHFR mutation, and I already had my 23 at the time.
Yeah.
My 23andMe. So I just went in their data and looked at it, and I had, the homozygous minor. So that makes me a very poor methylator. So I just went about it backwards.
Yeah, that's such a great point too. I think the future that everyone's positing is like, oh, you test first and then you figure out if you have, a genetic variant or a deficiency in something. But sometimes people do take the opposite sort of approach, where they find that they're very responsive to a particular supplement or medication, and they're like, hey, maybe this suggests that I have something. Now, I think you have to be careful with that approach, because it's not always indicative. Ironically, the example that I gave earlier, almost everyone will focus better on Adderall. Just because you do it doesn't mean you have ADHD, because it's a very powerful medication. But with stuff that you're talking about, like folate, if you don't have a particular issue with it, you're getting enough folic acid in your diet, you may not sort of notice any effects. By the way, was it 23andMe that already had that, or did you have to download your data set and upload it somewhere else in order to tell you about that variant?
I had to download it. At the time, they didn't have a UI to access particular variants, so I had to download it and upload it to my own system. Okay,
cool. Yeah, 'cause that was my understanding too. Is I think there's other websites now that can specifically tell you if you have that variation. And are you taking a quattrofolic? That's the kind that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I think so. I can look at it if you want. So I'm taking it's by Seeking Health. It's quattrofolic, correct? And methylgalactive methylcobalamin and adenosylcobalamin.
Yeah, that's my understanding, is that it's like the most active form of it. So not necessarily recommending it for everyone, but if you do, get your DNA tested, and you have that particular variant, it can be very helpful for folks because of the methylation issue that you mentioned. Interestingly, though, I'm increasingly finding that a lot of high quality multivitamins actually already have that form of folate, the quattrofolic, in them. Whether or not you have it, it's not particularly bad if you even if you don't have that genetic variant, to take some supplemental folic acid. Again, not medical advice, but like for instance, women who are pregnant are oftentimes almost universally recommended to take folic acid because it prevents congenital issues. And so if you look at common high quality supplements For instance, Pure Encapsulations has one called One. It's like one multivitamin that you take a day. Thorne, in my opinion, has the best multivitamin out there on the market right now. It's called Thorne Multi Elite, and it's NSF certified. It's for sports. So a lot of athletes take it because it's pure, and they made sure there's not any contaminations that cause any issues with their drug tests. I believe they also use quattrofolic in it. So it can be very helpful for folks. So obviously do your own research, talk to your own doctor, etc. But yeah, it's amazing how, if you do have some deficiencies, like I was talking about earlier, you're going to notice an even greater difference. Another great example of that is magnesium. So a lot of folks are magnesium deficient, and the moment that they start supplementing with magnesium, because you can obviously get it through diet, and you should try to get it as much as you can. I always believe your micronutrients through dietary whole foods, but it is hard to get enough magnesium, and when they take it, their mood improves, because magnesium really is an anxiolytic. It lowers anxiety. It can help people sleep, and so a lot of people who are kind of restless at night, active thinkers, really helps just calm them down, reduces stress levels, and really improves, I would say, mood, sleep, quality of life for a lot of folks, because they're deficient in it and they don't necessarily know. And as opposed to doing very expensive DNA testing, etc., you can kind of take the approach that you mentioned too, which is like magnesium is relatively safe, obviously in consultation with your doctor. But if you take a little bit of supplemental magnesium and you find that anecdotally you're feeling a lot better, it may suggest that you could benefit from it. You can always, by the way, track, through Chronometer. That's the nutrition tracking app that I recommend. I recommend almost everyone as almost like a check engine light or tune up for their body. Track a couple days of their food in terms of everything that you ate on a couple days. The benefit of that is it not only tells you your macros, but it'll tell you your micros. So by doing that, it'll tell you if you're eating enough magnesium, for instance. Are you getting enough folic acid, as we talked about? Like how much vitamin D are you getting from food? And it'll kind of point out areas of weakness, where if you're not getting enough, then you might be like, okay, maybe I need to eat some more foods that are high in magnesium. Or if I'm not getting enough calcium, maybe I should consume some yogurt or some eggs, things like that. And so you can just use it as like a analysis tool, and then improve your diet. That's the number one I would say, is try to fix your diet first, because there is easy dietary fixes for a lot of this stuff by just changing what you're eating. And then obviously if you're still not getting enough, like potassium, I would say it's like, you should try to get that from your diet. Magnesium, it's relatively safe. You can, it's easier to supplement with as opposed to potassium. And so you can consider experimenting with some supplementation as well. So trial and error is very helpful, but using some of these tools, whether it's 23andMe, we talked about Chronometer. I've previously talked about D-Minder, which is a vitamin D tracking app. You can use it to tell how much vitamin D you're getting from the sun. It's a very useful, tool as well. All of these are very helpful in terms of helping people sort of optimize, their macros and micros. And the goal, by the way, is not to be like a super obsessive, quantified self kind of person. I know for some people who are listening to this, they're like, oh my God, I gotta be a health nut and track everything. And I'm like, no, you don't have to do that. I actually recommend most people do not track on a regular basis. I personally, I will do this maybe once every few months, if that, because once I have my diet dialed in and I kind of eat similar sort of foods, I set it and forget it. I'm like, all right, I know I'm good on all my, macros, nutrients, blah, blah. I take my whatever supplements, and I'm good to go. And the reason I do it is because now I know I'm optimized, and I don't have to think about it. So as opposed to thinking about optimization as this almost like OCPD, like perfectionistic thing where you have to sit there and obsess and track all these things, that's obviously one way of doing it. I don't recommend that, and being like, taking a million different pills and, using a million different apps. As opposed to that, it's like you do it once, you really analyze kind of what's going on, you make some changes, you see if you feel better, and then you set it and forget it. And that's, by the way, the last thing that I recommend is whenever you experiment with anything, whether it's a medication, a supplement, or a behavioral intervention, is I actually really recommend people just keep a really basic journal, right? Because people don't, just even subjectively analyze whether it's working for them, right? So for instance, Alan, like you mentioned, like, okay, I took the supplement and I noticed a huge increase in focus, right? Now, sometimes it's so obvious you don't even need to write it down, but a lot of times it's subtle. Like a lot of times people don't put two and two together. And I'll give you an example. Ashwagandha is a really popular herbal supplement. It lowers cortisol, supposedly increases testosterone by about 14.7%, but it's really meaningless in my opinion. But it's super popular because everyone's stressed right now, and they're like, great, an anti-stress herb that's over the counter. I literally saw it at Costco the other day. Great, sounds good to me. The problem is it's psychoactive. It has almost effects, as I mentioned, that's similar to an SSRI. And so it actually causes insomnia and side effects in a decent number of people. But the thing is, you're taking this, maybe 3 days into it, you notice that all of a sudden your sleep is interrupted, you're waking up kind of, and you're like, is this because of work-related stress? Is it because it's hot now in LA and, you know, my temperature is high when I'm sleeping? Or, oh, wait a minute, I remembered I was taking ashwagandha, right? That's the benefit of journaling, is you start noticing associations between whatever your intervention or treatment is and, you know, how you're feeling. And sometimes these things are just kind of loose or vague, and until you start writing them down and say, hey, look, I'm taking this, let me see if there's a difference in whatever it is, my mood, my focus, my sleep, etc. And so I can evaluate whether it's working or not. Because here's the thing, if you don't really feel the difference, then I would say most of the time it's unnecessary, unless you know that there's a fundamental reason you should take it, right? Like I would say like vitamin D, magnesium, because almost everyone is deficient in it. It's probably safe to say that like you should just take it, period, regardless of whether you feel a huge subjective effect or not. But for some of the like less necessary supplements, I would say you should hopefully notice a benefit. And the only way you're going to notice it, because oftentimes they're really subtle, is you write it down, you track it. And if you find like after a few weeks you're not noticing a difference, then get rid of it, right? You should be thinking about your health and your routine as something to optimize in and of itself. You're optimizing your health, but you need to be optimizing your stack or your routine as well, and get rid of the stuff that isn't working for you, that you're not noticing a difference. Now, in order to do that, you have to be kind of meticulous, meaning you got to write down, you got to journal just for a little while. And then the other part of it is you got to be a little rigorous in your experimentation, meaning that the problem that a lot of people do, and I see this all the time, is they'll try 2-3 different things at once. They're tweaking their sleep, they're like trying to cool their bed, they're taking this new quadrafolic, and they're taking magnesium. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I'm feeling better. And I'm like, okay, great. What did you do? And they're like, well, I don't know. I changed 3 things. And I'm like, but which of the 3 was the part that is it all 3? It could be synergistic, or it literally could have been you tweaked your mattress. It had nothing to do with the supplements that you're taking. That's why you're sleeping better. So if you're trying to be almost rigorous and scientific about it, I really recommend people try to tweak one thing at a time if you're deciding whether to keep it or not. If you decide like, okay, vitamin D, I'm just going to take it forever and I don't need to worry about it, fine, then just take it and you don't need to experiment with it. But if it's a little bit more of an experimental thing that you're trying out for size, then I would say one thing at a time, log it in terms of journaling about it to see if it works. Give it, a few weeks to see if you notice a noticeable difference in terms of, whatever the outcome that you're trying to achieve. If it's great, keep it. If it's not, get rid of it. The other thing too is you may want to update that over time. There's a lot of supplements where people will notice some effect immediately. Now that could be due to placebo. And so one way, if you're curious about placebo, is you do what's called an ABA test. So these are single case controlled trials. And so you can literally do it on yourself. So for instance, track your sleep. Let's say you're only getting 7 hours of sleep. That's all you can get because you wake up early. You start taking 200 milligrams of elemental magnesium. All of a sudden you notice, now I'm sleeping 7.5 hours a night. I'm able to sleep in half an hour more. Great. So you notice a boost. It's pretty consistent over 14 days. And then you're like, is this placebo or not? Now you can discontinue it. So that's the ABA. So stop taking magnesium and then see if you go back to 7 hours of sleep. If that's the case, it's a higher evidence bar, and it suggests, like when I turn it on, it improves my sleep. When I turn it off, it decreases it. So it doesn't guarantee causality, because obviously there's a nocebo effect. Like if it was caused by placebo and you stop taking it, it theoretically can go away. But it shows a higher sort of level of evidence in that it probably is causing it. We can't say definitively because it's not a randomized control trial, but you can't kind of do a randomized controlled trial on yourself. This is the closest thing that you can do. You can do a case controlled trial. So you can do an A-B-A test, and then sometimes people do an A-B-A-B test. So they'll track their baseline, do the intervention, come off of it, and then they decide, oh, okay, it went from 7 to 7.5 hours of sleep, went back down to 7. I know it works, so now I'm going to take it again, and then it goes back to 7.5 hours. And then you're like, now I have pretty strong evidence that in the 2 periods of time that I took, let's say, magnesium, my sleep improved, and the 2 periods of time I did not take it before and in the middle, it was at 7 hours. That's even higher level of evidence that it probably works. Now, I know this sounds a little bit onerous, but it's really not. Like, you could literally take 30 seconds at the end of every day and be like, how much did I sleep last night? And if you just track that for 4 weeks and you try an intervention where 1 week you don't take it, 1 week you take it, 1 week you don't take it, and then the 4th week you decide whether to continue to take it, that's all it takes. This is literally like five minutes over the course of 1 month can definitively tell you whether a medication or supplement or behavioral intervention is actually working. And that's how a scientist would approach it. And I encourage you to be the same. I encourage everyone to kind of be, you don't need to be a scientist. You can kind of be an amateur scientist, but use experimental methodology to make sure that you're not taking a bunch of supplements or things that aren't actually working with you and you're just pissing away expensive vitamins. That's obviously no good. So definitely use sort of these methodologies that I'm kind of explaining to you by doing very simple, very light tracking. Doesn't have to be crazy, doesn't have to be onerous, but it can make a huge difference.
We had a question via YouTube. Antidepressant medication can be dangerous. For example, dry eye.
So is the question about side effects of antidepressant medications? Look, all medications basically have pros and cons, and so you have to evaluate them in the overall context of the costs and the benefits, right? So there's lots of potential side effects to SSRIs. So you mentioned one of them, which is dry eyes. I actually think it's one of the relatively minor side effects. Dry eyes can be alleviated by taking eye drops, and there's lots of good eye drops out there. In fact, I found one recently that I'm a big fan of. People are often familiar with hyaluronic acid. It's commonly used in cosmetics because it kind of absorbs moisture. I think it absorbs like 100 or 1,000 times its weight in moisture. And so it's kind of like plumps the skin. So you see it in a lot of skin creams and cosmetics. There's a form of it, sodium hyaluronate, I believe that's what it's called. And it actually naturally exists in your natural tears. And so as opposed to using kind of chemicals that don't naturally exist, it's basically saline, which is salt water, plus sodium hyaluronate. I'm doing a terrible job pronouncing it. Basically, the sodium form of hyaluronic acid. It's very effective eye drop. You can find it on Amazon. And there's one that specifically adds trehalose, which is a sugar alcohol, I believe, that's naturally exists in trees. And there's some clinical trials that show that it helps with the alleviation of dry eyes. Okay, so that tangent aside, it just shows that, look, even medication side effects can be alleviated with other medications, or obviously like spot or symptom reduction solutions like just using some eye drops. Now, if you have severe depression and your PCP or your psychiatrist says, hey, this is obviously not very functional, you're not getting out of bed, you're feeling terrible, it's interfering with your social and occupational functioning, you should be more worried about that than dry eyes, because there's ways of mitigating the dry eyes, as I said. Now, there may be some side effects that are more difficult to mitigate. As I mentioned, one of the most common ones are sexual side effects. In men in particular, it can cause anorgasmia, which is a difficulty orgasming. So it kind of makes sex obviously less fun when you're not able to orgasm and you get sort of a desensitization. That can also be mitigated, right? So sometimes they'll either, they can put you on an adjunctive medication like a Wellbutrin, buprenorphine, which is a serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, or other kinds of things. So I wouldn't say you should be obviously cognizant and aware of the side effects that medications and supplements come with. Supplements generally have less side effects than most prescription medications, but not always. It depends on the supplement. There's some supplements that are not that great, to be honest. Don't just assume that it's over the counter. It's always safe. They're also not necessarily pharmaceutically pure, so they may be adulterated with other stuff or heavy metals, and those can cause side effects because you're taking stuff that you didn't think you should be taking. But you need to weigh those side effects in terms of the benefits. So obviously, if the side effects outweigh the benefits for you, like you're not getting much of a mood benefit, and the sexual side effects are driving you crazy and making you unhappy, and you can't mitigate it with a second or third medication option, then obviously have that conversation with your doctor, and you need to either take a different medication or find a different solution. And maybe you need to just do a pure behavioral therapy or psychotherapy, and that's very little side effects to psychotherapy other than your time and money, I would say. But yeah, it's obviously easier on the body than medication. But if it works for you, and you're finding a huge, you're going from severe depression to mild depression, and you have minimal side effects, like you're just having the dry eyes, and those can be alleviated with just a eye drop, then don't be afraid of potential side effects. So that's the other thing too, is be aware of the frequency and type of side effects. All medications that are FDA approved have like a pamphlet. You can go find it online at drugs.com. So you can find the common side effects to any medication. So if a doctor recommends, hey, take Prozac or fluoxetine, very common SSRI for depression, you can look up the side effects. You can also literally publish the frequency of those. So if you're talking about something that, for instance, is a side effect that has a less than 1% chance, that means 99% of the time you're not going to have that side effect. You can obviously, make an educated guess in terms of like, okay, am I willing to take the risk? Have I tried alternative options? Is this the best possible thing for me? But you can almost predict to some degree the likelihood of you're going to run into it. And if it's 99% that you're not, you should not necessarily be afraid of a potential side effect just because it's listed in the television advertising. They have to disclose all the potential side effects, but it doesn't mean that it's common, right? So you should be aware of that. And then finally, you can obviously just try it, right? Most medications, for the most part, if you try it and you run into a side effect, like I said, you can discontinue it, and you find that it doesn't work for you. But I find most people actually miss out on a lot of the benefits of medication because they're almost like philosophically opposed to pharmacology. They have what I call chemophobia, which is like a phobia of chemistry. Like they think anything that doesn't come from the plants or the earths is like toxic and terrible for you. It's a completely nonsense, idea. Because like, for instance, aspirin, right, which is a common over-the-counter pharmaceutical pain and fever reliever, is a purified form of something that comes from the bark of a tree, and that Native Americans use in their indigenous medicine. So unless you like grinding up tree bark, which is a natural medicine, they're just using a pharmaceutically pure form of it. Is it natural? Is it pharmacological? It's somewhere in between, right? So even the definition between a chemical and a natural substance is really blurred when you take examples of things like aspirin. A lot of the natural stuff, in fact, that we find that is effective, we turn it into a drug, right? Look at pharmaceutical fish oil. It's now prescription for lipid management because eating fish is healthy for you. But a lot of people, especially Americans, don't eat enough fish. We don't eat very much of a Mediterranean diet. And so for people who don't, or they don't like fish for whatever reason, I meet a lot of people who don't like fish. I think that's sad. I love fish. Taking a supplemental, non-oxidized, high-quality form of fish oil can be a very effective supplement for them. Or if you have, some lipid issues that your doctor thinks could be improved by taking a supplemental fish oil or a prescription fish oil, right? So that's also an example. Like, is that natural? Is it not? It's actually from fish. It's just filtered to be pharmaceutically pure. So I think people should really get over their chemophobia, to be honest with you. You have to make it the best decision for you, and you have that conversation and consultation with your doctor, do your research about the side effects, ask them about it, and then make an informed decision about what the right thing is for you. And like I said, you can always try and see if you actually develop them. And if you do, you can either do something else to improve it, or you can just come off of it. But don't be afraid to try new things just because, all drugs are bad or whatever myths that are out there. All right, other folks with questions. So there's a question that was submitted about, do you recommend more cardio for fat loss, more weight training, or a mixture of both? I'm actually going to give you the contrarian answer to this, which is neither of the two. If you're really focused on fat loss, I would predominantly focus on your nutrition. Fat loss ultimately does come down to a caloric deficit. And while all calories are not equal, as Gary Taubes and other folks have pointed out, we do know that eating a caloric deficit can help you lose weight and drop body fat. And it's by far the easiest way, in my opinion, and most sustainable way of making sure that you're losing weight. We know, for instance, from the research literature, that the contribution of diet versus exercise to weight loss, it's predominantly diet. Exercise doesn't do that much. And we know this because there's really interesting studies where they have people who are sedentary train and do marathons, right? They go from couch potatoes to not only 5K, but like marathon runners, and they're still fat, right? Like, as someone who can run 26 miles is pretty athletic to some degree, at least in an endurance capacity. But the interesting that they found is that all that running increased their appetite, and they continued to eat more. And guess what? They ate more calories. And so every calorie that they were burning, they were just eating. And so they weren't necessarily losing weight. That's the problem with trying to use an exercise-focused approach to weight loss. You need to do both, right? That's the ideal situation. But I would say it's 80% diet, 20% exercise. Now, if it's talking about weight maintenance, exercise is very important for keeping the weight off once you've achieved it. And my kind of particular pet theory around that is it's really more psychological. The reason people relapse is because they get stressed, they stress eat or emotionally eat, and they kind of fall off the wagon and I give up. I'll never keep the weight off. But obviously, if you're exercising, it has I believe a moderate effect on depression, a mild effect on anxiety, or vice versa. And so it improves your mood to some degree. And so when people's mood is better, their ability to manage stress is better, they're less likely to relapse. So that's what I would say, is focus much more on your nutrition when it comes to fat loss. I particularly am a fan of lower carbohydrate diets. I don't think everyone needs to necessarily go on a ketogenic diet, but that's kind of an individual question for you is, are you willing to do it? If you are willing to do it, you're probably going to get better results than on let's say a low-fat diet. There's good research literature that validates that. And number two, is it sustainable for you? For a lot of people treat sort of ketogenic diets as a crash diet. They're like, I'm going to do this for 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks because it's hot girl summer or hot boy summer. And but I'm never going to be able to keep this up because I love bread or pizza and I can't do that. I don't recommend that in that case. Now, there is kind of a happy medium in the sense that if you follow sort of the original Atkins approach, and Verta Health actually documents this on their blog, so Volek and Finney, who are the godfathers of low carbohydrates diets, talk about this. They do an induction phase, right, where they almost cut out all carbs, and then there's kind of a weight loss phase where they try to keep the carbs under 50 grams of total carbohydrates per day. And then once they achieve their weight loss, you increase the carbohydrates to the level that you're starting to gain weight again, and then that becomes your individual carbohydrate tolerance. So for me, for instance, I could probably consume 100 grams of carbs a day because I'm very physically active, have a good metabolism, still pretty young, don't have a lot of body fat, and I'm still going to be able to maintain my weight and my blood sugar levels in a healthy way. So if you're doing a systematic program where it transitions, and we talked about this in a previous podcast, it can be okay to eat in a way that's unsustainable, but it's because there's a plan to transition, meaning that once you hit your goal weight or your body fat percentage that you're trying to achieve, then the rules change. You don't want to be in a caloric deficit forever. The problem in particular, we talk about hormone optimization, is when you're in a caloric deficit, meaning that you're eating less calories than you're burning. The problem is your energy levels are low because your body gets under stress. Your cortisol levels increase, and we know that cortisol is a catabolic. It kind of wastes muscle, and so it's not great for optimal hormone levels when you're on a caloric deficit. That's why when people's hormone levels are the best, they're eating either a eucaloric, which is like they're maintaining the same amount of calories in and out, or they're in a hypercaloric where they're trying to gain weight and bulk up, as bodybuilders like to say. It's really actually better for your hormones when you're doing that. So you have to kind of balance like weight loss and hormone optimization. But so what I would try to do to kind of mitigate the negative effects is don't do extreme caloric deficit. It's not sustainable. And even if you're doing it as a crash diet, it can really throw off your, your cortisol levels, throw off your hormones. And also, you're just going to be tired, hungry, and cranky, right? You ever talk to someone who's on a crash diet and they're eating like, I would say a 500 plus caloric deficit? You're starving, right? And when you're starving, your brain is not working right. You're almost in like a fight or flight mode. And it's not a great thing. So my recommendation is don't go over a 500 calorie deficit, because it really becomes taxing both psychologically and physiologically. I generally recommend people do like 100, 200 calorie deficit, because it's more sustainable. You'll barely notice the difference between 100, 200 calories if you're eating one or two less. It's like if you eat, I don't know, one or two less bananas, like that's 100, 200 calories. And otherwise you're pretty much eating the same thing. But if you add up the math, right, that's 700 to 1400 calories per week that you're cutting. And slowly but surely, you're going to start dropping body fat. You're going to start dropping body weight. You'll do better. So that's, I think, by far the best approach for fat loss. Now, you should be doing your weight training, but you should be doing it for other reasons. The primary benefit of weight training, in my opinion, is to put on as much lean mass as possible, right? It's less for fat loss. Now, it does help with fat burning. These are not completely mutually exclusive things, but you're doing it for that reason. And obviously, there's a huge psychological benefit to strength training as well, in terms of discipline and pushing yourself and pain tolerance, quite frankly. Now, if you do want to do some supplemental cardio, I think it can be helpful. If you obviously talk to a lot of bodybuilders, Arnold Schwarzenegger and stuff did do supplemental cardio. Now, you have to take a little bit what they say with a grain of salt, because they were on also a ton of performance enhancing drugs. So a lot of the stuff that they did was a little bit extreme. But that being said, the first thing that I would focus on is, like I said, number one, prioritize your diet. Number two, make sure you're getting enough low intensity, steady state exercise, meaning walking, right? You want to be walking 7,500 steps a day is a general rule of thumb that is in line with CDC guidelines. I always say try to get 1,000 steps for every hour of sleep that you're trying to get. So 7 to 9 hours of sleep means 7,000 to 9,000 steps. So that's about the amount of steps that you're getting. It really improves your metabolism when you walk a lot. And I would particularly recommend breaking it up throughout the day. It's much better to, let's say, go for 7 walks of 1,000 steps than to go for 1 walk of 7,000 steps. The reason for that is if you sit on your ass all day for 12 hours at work and then you go for 1 long walk at the end, even though the number of steps is the same, your metabolism has slowed down during those 12 hours and you're not burning very many calories. Versus if every hour on the hour you take a 10-minute walk, you walk 1,000 steps, 10 minutes about 1,000 steps, you do that 7 times all throughout the day, it prevents your body from slowing down. And so when you're sitting excessively, it slows down your metabolism. When you get up and walk, it counteracts that. And so it actually improves, even though 2 people can be walking 7,000 steps, exactly the same amount of steps, the person who breaks it up and does it as frequently as possible is going to have a better, faster metabolism than someone who just does it once. There's also some research to validate this. There was one study that I saw that encouraged people to go on, I believe it was 15-minute walks 3 times a day. It was after every meal. And in that case, it improved their postprandial blood plasma glucose response, which is just a fancy word for your blood sugar levels after every meal. They get spiked less, or they go up less when you basically just take a walk after every meal. Now, the interesting thing is that this is like a very rigorously done scientific study, but it's almost very Lindy or traditional in a way. Like a lot of cultures, just traditionally, after you eat, everyone says, hey, I'm feeling kind of heavy. Let's go for a walk. And I think people anecdotally, almost like through trial and error, just like Alan was talking about with methylfolate, found that they feel better when they go for a walk after they have a lot of carbs, because it helps burn them. So that's the best thing you can do. In fact, is go for frequent walks all throughout the day to make sure that your metabolism is primed. And if you really want to go above and beyond that, sure, do a little bit of cardio. I'm a bigger fan of high intensity interval training rather than moderate intensity long runs. I think that actually contributes more catabolism and more cortisol that you already don't need, because if you're on a calorie cut or a caloric deficit, you're already putting your body under strain, so you don't need more cardio to exacerbate that. If I'm on a caloric deficit, I'd be very careful about the volume of training that I'm doing. You may want to do more like 3 days a week of strength training versus 5 days a week of strength training if you're really cutting your calories, because you want to make sure that you're not burning yourself out and that you have appropriate rest days to recover. So you want to adjust your volume. If you're eating a lot of calories and you're bulking, then great, go nuts on the volume and try to get as much as you can. But there's different rules basing on how much you're eating. So that's what I recommend. Maybe one day a week of high intensity interval training, doing some sort of sprint or some sort of natural interval exercise like basketball, soccer, something that you enjoy, dancing, is a great sort of supplemental cardio that can help fat loss. And a lot of bodybuilders do some supplemental cardio outside of the gym as well. But I would say that's like a 95th percentile kind of thing. I would say make sure you focus on your diet and your walking, and that will be enough for 95% of people. If you're really trying to get super lean, or you're being a bodybuilder or that kind of thing, then sure, do a little bit of supplemental running or other things. I don't think most people need to do it though.
6:57.
All right, I think we got 2 to 3 minutes left. If anyone wants to ask one last question, we have time for one more. Hey there, I'm gonna just turn up your volume. Go ahead.
Perfect. So I have a quick question regarding like hygiene products.
Yep.
Specifically like deodorant, like natural deodorant or natural cologne and stuff like that, or toothpaste.
Yep.
It's like I was just like reading about deodorant has aluminum.
Correct.
And stuff like that. So I'm kind of a little bit concerned about it. I did a little bit of research, but I thought that you'd know a lot more about it. So kind of curious about your recommendations.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a difference between antiperspirants and deodorants. Antiperspirants work by blocking the pores of your underarms, and that's why they use aluminum. Aluminum tends to block the pores and prevent you from perspiring or sweating. That's why they work really well. But to me, I'm like, we don't know how bad aluminum is. Quite frankly, there's some concern that it's carcinogenic or cancer causing. I think the jury is out, but my opinion is why risk it? Putting sort of an unnatural substance there. And also that part of the skin absorbs a lot. So you should pretty much assume that anything you rub under your underarms is getting absorbed by the system. You have a lot of lymph nodes in that area too. Your lymphatic system is responsible for your immune system. And so, it can get absorbed with that. And the incidences of leukemia and lymphoma are very high these days, or higher than they at least used to be. So I personally do not recommend aluminum-based deodorants. Also, you shouldn't be blocking your pores. I know it's not great to sweat out a shirt, especially in hot weather. But by the way, a really great tip is there are, if you're wearing like a dress shirt underneath it, or a polo shirt, or kind of a collared shirt, there are sweat blocking undershirts that you can buy that have like, it's almost like a pad underneath the your underarms, and they work fantastic. So for instance, like I have like merino wool cashmere sweaters that are delicate, and you just can't wash these things all the time. They get ruined. And so, but if you just throw on an undershirt underneath it, you can sweat and it won't get to the sweater. And so you can literally re-wear these sweaters because they don't get your sweat on them as a guy. You don't need to wash them every time. So, and same thing with dress shirts, which are expensive to like go get dry cleaned, and they get ruined over time. The best solution is prevention. You buy sort of these if you wear an undershirt, these sweat blocking sort of shirts. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, don't use antiperspirants. Your body sweats for a reason. Sweat is used to cool you down. And so, you don't want to do that. Deodorants obviously just mask the smell. but it doesn't really work because all you're doing is like putting perfume or cologne on top of your body odor, and body odor is basically caused by bacteria that consumes some of the constituents of your sweat. So I am a bigger fan of natural deodorants. The trick though is most natural deodorants in the market cheat essentially. They use baking soda. Baking soda is dirt cheap, but how it works is it basifies the pH of your skin. Your skin is naturally acidic. It has what's called an acid mantle. So if you remember your basic chemistry, pH kind of goes on a 14-point scale. 7 is considered pH neutral. Your skin, though, is slightly acidic. It's about a pH of 5-ish. But when you add baking soda, it increases it to about a 7 or 8. What happens by doing that is it prevents the bacteria that naturally grow in your skin from growing. So it does really work. I would say skip the $12 like Tom's or Native deodorant. And if you really wanted to use something like that, just take a little bit of baking soda, put it under your underarms. Works just as well. The problem with that, though, is when you mess up your skin's acid mantle, it messes with the pH of your skin, and it can actually cause opportunistic skin infections. And so people actually develop candida. You should actually read the reviews of those natural deodorants. You'll see that like 1 out of every 10 reviews, people talk about redness, irritation, or skin infection that they develop. So I do not recommend using baking soda-based natural deodorants, and you need to look at the ingredients. Number 2, the crystal sticks that you see that are natural use something called potassium alum. And even though it is a crystal that's extracted from whatever it is, potassium alum is another form of aluminum. So that works, but also if you're trying to avoid aluminum, you're getting much of the same thing. So the solution that I really recommend is actually zinc. Zinc is a natural antibacterial. It does not change the pH of your skin as much as baking soda, so you don't get the opportunistic skin infections. And third, zinc is a natural mineral that's good for your body. So even if you absorb some zinc, great. Like I take supplementals, there's like 25 milligrams of zinc in my multivitamin, right? And you get zinc in seafood and all kinds of food. So it's not bad if you absorb a little bit of zinc in your system. So the best way of fighting zinc, ironically, is it's used in diaper cream. So there's lots of great diaper creams out there. I know it sounds a little weird, but they're not diaper cream. It's just a zinc cream. And if you look on Amazon, I believe some of them are in stick form. I'll post a link after the show where you can use it in a stick form, or some of them are in a cream form. You just take a little dab of it, rub it under your underarms. Works fantastically well. Even if you're a sweater, you will still perspire because, like I said, it's not an antiperspirant, but it does block the bacteria from growing, and it prevents the smell as a result. So yeah, zinc-based, in my opinion, best natural deodorant out there. I've tried everything. And maybe in the future we'll even launch it as a product because there's none that I've seen that have like been marketed well as deodorants. So that's my natural antiperspirant tip. All right, great question, great show today. Maximus Call-In Radio show number 28. We talked a little bit at the beginning of the show in this week's Weekly Unpopular Opinion about the relationship between testosterone and dopamine, how there's a bidirectional relationship and they're kind of synergistic, and how I think the future of kind of mood optimization and psychiatry is actually neuroendocrinology in optimizing your hormones instead of neurotransmitters. We had a caller call in and talk about taking methylfolate and how they realized that they had a genetic variant in it and how improving that really improved their mood. And so I talked about how if you're going to take any medication, supplement, or treatment, ways of experimenting with it so that you know that it's working by using sort of case-controlled studies where you do an ABA test to make sure that it's actually working for you. We talked a little bit about methods for burning body fat, and I talked about focusing on nutrition versus exercise and actually focusing on walking over running and sort of moderate intensity cardio, and why that's sort of a superior approach. So great questions. If you have any additional questions, please submit them and we'll address them next week, same time, Thursdays at 6 o'clock. So be well, Maximizers, and I'll catch you online on our Discord discussion forum. Take care.